Hello and welcome back to another video. Today, we're going to talk about the most ridiculous looking triceps extension that you've literally ever seen in your life. And yet, we're going to talk about why it's actually my favorite triceps extension to do, along with one other that's pretty much the same thing, just in a different position. Okay, so first of all, I'll just sort of let this play so that you guys and girls can actually see what's going on here. It's basically a single arm cable triceps extension with a little bit of a twist, right? And the twist, hopefully, is obvious, which is that I'm using what is, in this case, a seatbelt, but which really, in any case, could be just something that's kind of doing what the seatbelt is doing here. So what is the purpose of this seatbelt, and why do I love this particular triceps extension so much? And how can you set it up a little bit more practically if you don't have something like this seatbelt? We'll talk about all those things. So the first thing to consider is that whenever we're talking about triceps and triceps extensions, a lot of the time we tend to view the conversation of training triceps as very, very distinct from training biceps. In other words, when we see most biceps variations like preacher curls, right, curls with your arms sort of pinned up against a machine, right, with just a normal curl with your arms at your sides, all these different variations are set up such that we place something behind the back of the upper arm, right? So if I was doing a curl, a lot of times people will put stuff behind the upper arm, and that doesn't seem crazy or silly to anyone. But the minute that we do it for a triceps extension, right, which is effectively what this whole thing here is for, right, the minute that we put something here that just pulls in this opposite direction, all of a sudden it's something that looks crazy and ridiculous and like it would, be something from outer space and not that anyone would realistically do. But the reason why, especially in the case of this kind of cable triceps extension, this support is so useful and, in my opinion, just makes everything feel so much better. I've had so many people try this kind of thing and report not only just a more localized stimulus to the triceps, but also so much more comfort around the shoulder, is for the following reasons. Okay, so I'll leave this pause here just for a second. But when we think about, okay, what is this cable doing? Right, it's pulling upward in that direction. So obviously, if there is a line of force that is going in that direction, and we have our forearm segment here, that line of force basically just wants to rotate the forearm upward that way. In other words, it's a resistance that applies what's known as an elbow flexion moment, which is just fancy language, technical language to describe the fact that when we do this, right, our triceps are getting challenged, right? That's a simple way to think about it, is the resistance is just bending the elbow, right? But what it's also doing, and what people often neglect that it's doing, is, and this is on some level, it's so obvious and it's so sort of close up to view that it's difficult to see and that we forget about it. But if we have a resistance that is over this way, and just imagine that I don't have this strap here, right? What it is also doing, simultaneous to bending my elbow, is actually pulling this entire segment forward, right? And it's also, to some degree, trying to sort of shrug my shoulder upward. Those are the two sort of components of what this resistance is doing. So if my arm is getting pulled forward in that direction, especially as I go to initiate the triceps extension, I'm going to have to be fighting and managing the shoulder joint and the shoulder girdle, in some cases equally, if not more, than the forces at the elbow. Right? Because if you picture this variation, but like imagine the cable was maybe over here or something, coming from this direction, and we were looking at, okay, what are the distances to the shoulder and to the elbow there? The distances in this case just representing effectively resistance, relative resistance between the shoulder and the elbow. The shoulder might have even more resistance placed on it than the elbow. Okay, so circling back, what is the purpose of this strap? Well, the purpose of this strap is basically to prevent not only your shoulder getting pulled forward in this direction, but to prevent you from having to use shoulder tissues and shoulder muscles during this motion, right? And as a consequence of that, much in the exact same way that we do something like a preacher curl, putting something here, I'm placing something on the front side of my biceps, really the lowermost portion, right above the elbow joint. If this is the elbow joint, it's right here. And I'm essentially pulling myself into it so that when I initiate this extension downward, my shoulder, number one, gets just pulled directly into this thing. And number two, as a consequence of that, it actually just gets absorbed by this line of force from the seatbelt itself, right? Which I then don't have to deal with. And something that you'll also note is that I also am sort of, my body is leaned forward in this direction, right? I have this leg straight and not a lot of weight on this leg. And then also with this hand right here, I'm actually pulling the pole slightly that way so that I can actually pull my arm more easily into the anchor, which is what I call it, is just an anchor, right? So how I would get into this if I were you all, which again, I'm using a seatbelt. I ordered this seatbelt from Jim Pin. It is fantastic. You can also order something like a daisy chain. Daisy chains go for like $10 on Amazon or something like that. There are a ton of different options here. The principle remains the same though, which is basically just put something on the bottom of the biceps or around that area, pull yourself into it, and then just do a triceps extension, right? In fact, it's really not as ridiculous as it looks, right? It's just conceptually, we're not used to seeing variations like this for the triceps. And so whenever sort of a new exercise or a quote unquote new exercise is demonstrated to us, right? Even though principally it's very, very similar to, again, something like a preacher curl, it appears ridiculous. It appears silly. But I think in this particular case, it is anything but. Okay, so I recognize that in some ways, this is not the most practical thing for people to do, right? I'm taking up two sides of a cable column. In this particular context, I was filming for my exercise library, and this is my apartment gym. And so no one was in there. It was earlier in the day. So I was able to do it, right? But I recognize that not everyone is fortunate enough to have the space, and not everyone is fortunate enough to be able to just have the money lying around to buy a seatbelt that's like, $30 or $40 or whatever it happens to be with shipping. So what is an alternative strategy that we can use here? Well, we could do something like this, where instead what you'll notice is it's just a normal tricep extension, but I'm on a cable column, normal looking cable column, and the back of my arm is now braced up against the column this way. And in this particular context, this is actually appropriate because now look at the resistance. The resistance is actually pulling me backward. And so when I push out against it, there's actually some degree of this resistance that will be sort of shoving my arm backward to some degree. This can change depending on how you set this up, right? The more the cable kind of moves in that direction, the more that your arm will get pulled forward, right? But in this particular case, what we can do is just, even if it doesn't make complete sense relative to what the force is trying to do to our arm, we can just jam the upper arm into that cable column, right, as we go through the motion. And this has, specific instructions. This is a video taken from my exercise library. But basically the principle is the same, is just find a way to put your upper arm up against a brace so that your upper arm doesn't have to do a lot of work. And I believe I've covered this specific variation in the context of another video, but again, principally it is similar. Now, do I prefer this variation? It's probably a little bit more convenient, less annoying to set up. So in certain contexts, I do. But if we look back at this particular variation, we do have a little bit more of a direct support for the upper arm, specifically in this case, again, because that cable is pulling the shoulder forward and because of the fact that this is on the front side of the arm as compared to the back. So in the most optimal unconstrained scenario, this is the one that I would go for. And this is the one personally that I have chosen more recently. But if I were in a busy gym at a busy time, like you could literally do what I just did in that previous variation up against one of these cable columns. But ultimately the principles remain the same. Find a way to fix the upper arm, and your triceps and your shoulders will thank you. And for those of you who are potentially thinking that this might actually detract from stimulus of the long head of the triceps in particular, I would encourage you to think about how much of a shoulder extensor muscle the long head of the triceps actually is, because functionally it is practically not a shoulder extensor muscle. And if none of that last little bit made sense to you, that's totally fine. Don't worry about it because it's pretty much irrelevant anyway. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you have questions about this video, please drop them below.
Are you tired of guessing which exercises will actually work for you? Are you tired of hitting plateaus that make progress feel impossible? Or even worse, dealing with pains that actually stop you from lifting? It's time for all these problems to disappear with the Modern Meathead Exercise Library. Here's what you'll gain when you become a member of the library. Instant and lifetime access to hundreds of step-by-step tutorials to walk you through each and every exercise that you can possibly imagine. Every exercise is categorized by specific muscle muscle group. So when you get the library, you'll basically be able to point to any muscle on your body, go into the library and train it on that day. Now here's what you're gonna lose when you get the library. Number one, you're gonna lose all the frustration associated with doing exercises that don't deliver results. Number two, you're gonna stop wasting time doing exercises that don't actually target the muscles you're trying to target. Number three, those aches and pains that you're constantly experiencing, a lot of that stuff comes from poor exercise selection and poor exercise execution. So what's gonna happen if you don't get the library? Well, you might stay stuck and just hit the same walls over and over and over again. The pain that you currently have, it might just still linger on forever. And maybe worst of all, you might waste weeks and months and even years of training because you're just picking all the wrong exercises for your goals. But when you get the library today, you'll gain instant and lifetime access to the library where you'll have everything you need to break through any one of these problems. And guess what? If you're confused about an exercise that isn't in the library, you can simply request a tutorial and I'll make sure that it gets added to the library as soon as possible. At the time of this filming, the library has only been live for about a week and I've already added an extra 20 plus exercises from launch. And these all have come from specific member requests for more exercises. So with your one-time purchase, you get access to every existing tutorial and all future tutorials. So click the button below and don't let one more week of lifting go by wasted.